Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, another in our series from the Chronicles of Shadow Valley by Lord Dunsany. If you've been listening to all of the Chronicles of Shadow Valley episodes together, there's now a skip in the narrative. Morano and Rodriguez have been travelling for a while. They've managed to fool the Garda into letting them past by Rodrigo disguising himself as Morano and Morano disguising himself as Rodrigo. They've had quite a bit of talk about the importance of bacon in war, and now we come to a mountain where a wizard lives. It takes about half the chapter, 25 minutes in Ed Humple's recording, for us actually to get through the front door and meet the wizard. In that time we meet only his servant, who is aged but believes that his master could make him young again. There is also, far after this incident, when the castle disappears, at least some hint that he's not a person at all, but perhaps a squirrel. So now Don Rodriguez is entering with Morano into what is probably a Reggio-filled tower of a wizard from the University of Saragossa. The wizard has a strange habit of forcing people who visit him to undergo mystagogic initiations. This week we'll look at his first initiation, the initiation of war. Now over to Ed Humple, who released this recording into the public domain through LibriVox. Thanks again to Ed.
"Who is this professor?" he said. By the light of a torch that sputtered in an iron clamp on the wall, Rodriguez questioned him with these words, and Morano with his wondering, wistful eyes. The old man halted and turned half round, and lifted his head and answered. "In the University of Saragossa," he said with pride, "he holds the chair of magic." Even the names of Oxford or Cambridge, Harvard or Yale or Princeton move some respect, and even yet in these unlearned days. What wonder then that the name of Saragossa, heard on that lonely mountain, awoke in Rodriguez some emotion of reverence and even awed Morano. As for the chair of magic, it was of all the royal endowments of the illustrious university the most honoured and dreaded. "At Saragossa," Rodriguez muttered. "At Saragossa," the old man affirmed. Between the ancient citadel of learning and this most savage mountain appeared a gulf scarce to be bridged by thought. "The professor rests in the mountain," the old man said, "because of a conjunction of the stars unfavourable to study, and his class have gone to their homes for many weeks." He bowed again, and led on along that corridor of dismal stone. The others followed, and still as Rodriguez went, that famous name Saragossa echoed within his mind. And then they came to a door set deep in the stone, and their guide opened it, and they went in, and there was the professor in a mystical hat and robe of dim purple, seated with his back to them, at a table studying the ways of the stars. "Welcome, Don Rodriguez," said the professor before he turned around. And then he rose, and with small steps backward and sideways, and many bows, he displayed all those formulae of politeness that Saragossa knew in the golden age, and which her professors loved to execute. In later years they became more elaborate still, and afterwards were lost. Rodriguez replied rather by instinct than knowledge. He came of a house whose bows had never missed graceful ease, and which had in some generations been a joy to the court of Spain. Morano followed behind him, but his servile presence intruded upon that elaborate ceremony, and the professor held up his hand, and Morano was held in mid-stride, as though the air had gripped him. There he stood motionless, having never felt magic before, and when the professor had welcomed Rodriguez in a manner worthy of the dignity of the chair that he held at Saragossa, he made an easy gesture, and Morano was free again. "Master," said Morano to the professor, as soon as he found he could move, "Master, it looks like magic." Picture to yourself some yokel shown into the library of a professor of Greek at Oxford, taking down from the shelf one of the books of the Odyssey, and saying to the professor, "It looks like Greek." Rodriguez felt grieved by Morano's boorish ignorance. Neither he nor his host answered him. The Professor explained that he followed the mysteries dimly, owing to a certain aspect of Orion, and that therefore his class were gone to their homes and were hunting, and so he studied alone, under unfavourable auspices. And once more he welcomed Rodriguez to his roof, and would command straw to be laid down for the man that Rodriguez had brought from the Inn of the Dragon and Knight, for he, the Professor, saw all things, though certain stars would hide everything. And when Rodriguez had appropriately uttered his thanks, he added with all humility and delicate choice of phrase a petition that he might be shown some mere rudiment of the studies for which that illustrious chair in Saragossa was famous. The Professor bowed again, and, in accepting the well-rounded compliments that Rodriguez paid to the honoured post he occupied, he introduced himself by name. He had once been, he said, the Count of the Mountain, but when his astral studies had made him eminent and he had mastered the ways of the planet nearest the sun, he took the title Magister Mercurii, and by this had long been known, but had now forsaken this title, great as it was, for a more glorious nomenclature, and was called in the Arabic language the Slave of Orion. When Rodriguez heard this he bowed very low. And now the Professor asked Rodriguez in which of the activities of life his interest lay, for the chair of magic at Saragossa, he said, was concerned with them all. "In war," said Rodriguez. And Morano unostentatiously rubbed his hands, for here was one, he thought, who would soon put his master on the right way, and matters would come to a head, and they would find the wars. But far from concerning himself with the wars of that age, the Slave of Orion explained that as events came nearer they became grosser or more material, and that their grossness did not leave them until they were some while passed away, so that to one whose studies were with aerial things, near events were opaque and dim. He had a window, he explained, through which Rodriguez could clearly see the ancient wars, while another window beside it looked on all wars of the future except those which were planned already or were coming soon to earth, and which were either invisible or seen dim as through mist. Rodriguez said that to be privileged to see so classical an example of magic would be to him both a delight and an honour, yet, as is the way of youth, he desired more to have a sight of the wars than he cared for all the learning of the Professor. And to him who held the chair of magic at Saragossa it was a precious thing that his windows could be made to show these marvels, and the guest to whom he was about to display these two gems of his learning was thinking of little but what he should see through the windows, and not at all of what spells, what midnight oil, what incantations, what witchcrafts, what lonely hours among bats had gone to the gratification of his young curiosity. It is usually thus. The Professor rose. His cloak floated out from him as he left the chamber, and Rodriguez, following where he guided, saw, by torchlight in the corridors upon the dim purple borders, signs that, to his untutored ignorance of magic, were no more than hints to the affairs of the zodiac. And if these signs were obscure, it were better they were obscurer, for they dealt with powers that man needs not to possess, who has the whole earth to regulate and control. Why then should he seek to govern the course of any star? And Morano followed behind them, hoping to be allowed to get a sight of the wars. They came to a room where two round windows were, each of them larger than the very largest plate, and of very thick glass indeed, and of a wonderful blue. The blue was like the blue of the Mediterranean at evening, when lights are in it both of ships and of sunset, and lights of harbours being lit one by one, and the light of Venus perhaps, and about two other stars, so deeply did it stare, and so twinkled near its edges with lights that were strange to that room, and so triumphed with its clear beauty over the night outside. No, it was no more magical than the Mediterranean at evening, even though the peaks of the Esterels be purple, and their bases melting in gold, and the blue sea lying below them smiling at early stars. These windows were more mysterious than that. It was more a triumphant blue. It was like the Mediterranean seen with the eyes of Shelley, on a happy day of his youth, or like the sea round western islands of fable seen by the fancy of Keats. They were no windows for any need of ours, unless our dreams be needs, unless our cries for the moon be urged by the same necessity that makes us cry for bread. They were clearly concerned only with magic or poetry, though the Professor claimed that poetry was but a branch of his subject. And it was so regarded at Saragossa, where it was taught by the name of theoretical magic, whilst by the name of practical magic they taught dooms, brews, hauntings, and spells. The Professor stood before the left-hand window and pointed to its deep blue centre. "Through this," he said, "we see the wars that were." Rodriguez looked into the deep blue centre where the great bulge of the glass came out towards him. It was near to the edges where the glass seemed thinner that the little strange lights were dancing. Morano dared to tiptoe a little nearer. Rodriguez looked and saw no night outside. Just below and near to the window was white mist, and the dim lines and smoke of what may have been recent wars. But farther away, on a plain of strangely vast dimensions, he saw old wars that were. War after war he saw. Battles that long ago had passed into history, and had been for many ages skilled, glorious, and pleasant encounters, he saw even now tumbling before him in their savage confusion and dirt. He saw a leader, long glorious in histories he had read, looking around puzzled, and in a very famous fight that he had planned very well. He saw retreats that history called routs, and routs that he had seen history calling retreats. He saw men winning victories without knowing they had won. Never had man pried before so shamelessly upon history, or found her such a liar. With his eyes on the great blue glass, Rodriguez forgot the room, forgot time, forgot his host and poor excited Morano, as he watched those famous fights. And now my reader wishes to know what he saw, and how it was that he was able to see it. As regards the second, my reader will readily understand that the secrets of magic are very carefully guarded, and any smatterings of it that I may ever have come by I possess, for what they are worth, subjects to oaths and penalties, at which even bad men shudder. My reader will be satisfied that even those intimate bonds between reader and writer are of no use to him here. I say him as though I had only male readers, but if my reader be a lady I leave the situation confidently to her intuition. As for the things he saw, of all these I am at full liberty to write. They would differ from history's version. Never a battle that Rodriguez saw on all the plain that swept away from that circular window, but history wrote differently. And now, my reader, the situation is this: who am I? History was a goddess among the Greeks, or is at least a distinguished personage, perhaps with a well-earned knighthood, and certainly with widespread recognition amongst the right kind of people. I have done none of these things. Whom then would you believe? Yet I lay my story confidently before you, my reader, trusting in the justice of my case and in your judicial discernment. But for one other thing: what will the goddess Clio say, or the well-deserving knight, if I offend history? She has stated her case. Sir Bartimaeus has written it, and then so late in the day I come with a different story, a truer but different story. What will they do? Reader, the future is dark, uncertain, and long. I dare not trust myself to it, if I offend history. Clio and Sir Bartimaeus may make hay of my reputation, an innuendo here, a foolish fact there. They know how to do it, and not a soul will suspect the goddess of personal malice, or the great historian of pique. Rodriguez gazed then through the deep blue window, forgetful of all around, on battles that had not all the elegance or neatness of which our histories so tidily tell. And as he gazed upon a merry encounter between two men on the fringe of an ancient fight, he felt a touch on his shoulder, and then almost a tug, and turning round beheld the room he was in. How long he had been absent from it in thought he did not know, but the Professor was still standing with folded arms where he had left him, probably well satisfied with the wonder that his most secret art had awakened in his guest. It was Morano who touched his shoulder, unable to hold back any longer his impatience to see the wars. His eyes, as Rodriguez turned around, were gazing at his master with dog-like wistfulness. The absurd eagerness of Morano, his uncouth touch on his shoulder, seemed only pathetic to Rodriguez. He looked at the Professor's face, the nose like a hawk's beak, the small eyes deep down beside it, dark of hue and dreadfully bright, the silent lips. He stood there uttering no actual prohibition, concerning which Rodriguez's eyes had sought. So, stepping aside from his window, Rodriguez beckoned Morano, who at once ran forward delighted to see those ancient wars. A slight look of scorn showed faint upon the Professor's face, such as you may see anywhere when a master craftsman perceives the gaze of the ignorant turned toward his particular subject. But he said no word, and soon speech would have been difficult, for the loud clamour of Morano filled the room. He had seen the wars and his ecstasies were ungoverned. As soon as he saw those fights he looked for the infidels, for his religious mind loved most to see the infidels slain. And if my reader discern or suppose some gulf between religion and the recent business of the Inn of the Dragon and Knight, Morano, if driven to admit any connection between murder and his daily bread, would have said, "All the more need then for God's mercy through the intercession of his most blessed saints." But these words had never passed Morano's lips, for shrewd as he was in inquiry into any matter that he desired to know, his shrewdness was no less in avoiding enquiry where there might be something that he desired not to know, such as the origin of his wages as servant of the Inn of the Dragon and Knight, those delicate gold rings, with settings empty of jewels. Morano soon recognized the infidel by his dress, and after that no other wars concerned him. He slapped his thigh, he shouted encouragement, he howled vile words of abuse, partly because he believed that this foul abuse was rightly the due of the infidel, and partly because he believed it delighted God. Rodriguez stood and watched, pleased at the huge joy of the simple man. The slave of Orion stood watching in silence too, but who knows if he felt pleasure or any other emotion? Perhaps his mind was simply like ours. Perhaps, as has been claimed by learned men of the best informed period, that mind had some control upon the comet, even when farthest out from the paths we know. Morano turned round for a moment to Rodriguez. "Good wars, master, good wars," he said with a vast zest, and at once his head was back again at the calm blue window. In that flash of the head Rodriguez had seen his eyes, blue, round and bulging. The round man was like a boy who in some shop window had seen, unexpected, huge forbidden sweets. Clearly, in the war he watched, things were going well for the cross, for such cries came from Morano as, "A pretty stroke! There now, the dirty infidel! Now, see God's power shown! Spare him not, good knight, spare him not!" and many more, till, uttered faster and faster, they merged into mere clamorous rejoicing. But the battles beyond the blue window seemed to move fast, and now a change was passing across Morano's rejoicings. It was not that he swore more for the cause of the cross, but brief, impatient, meaningless oaths slipped from him now and then. He was becoming irritable. A puzzled look, as far as Rodriguez could see, was settling down on his features. For a while he was silent, except for the little, meaningless oaths. Then he turned round from the glass, his hands stretched out, his face full of urgent appeal. "Masters," he said, "God's enemy wins." In answer to Morano's pitiful look, Rodriguez's hand went to his sword hilt. The slave of Orion merely smiled with his lips. Morano stood there with his hands still stretched out, his face still all appeal, and something more, for there was reproach in his eyes that men could tarry while the cross was in danger and the infidel lived. He did not know that it was all finished and over hundreds of years ago, a page of history upon which pages were turned, and which lay as unalterable as the fate of some warm swift creature of early Eocene days, over whose fossil today the strata lay long silent. "But can nothing be done, master?" he said when Rodriguez told him of this. And when Rodriguez failed him here, he turned away from the window. To him the infidel were game, but to see them defeating Christian knights violated the deeps of his feelings. Morano sulky excited little more notice from his host and his master, who had watched his rejoicings, and they seemed to have forgotten this humble champion of Christendom. The Professor slightly bowed to Rodriguez and extended a graceful hand. He pointed to the other window. "Reader, your friend shows you his collection of stamps, his fossils, his poems, or his luggage labels. One of them interests you, you look at it a while, you are ready to go away. Then your friend shows you another. This must also be seen, for your friend's collection is a precious thing. It is that point upon the huge earth on which his spirit has lit, on which it rests, on which it shelters even, who knows from what storms? Too slight, as it were, to weaken some hold as his spirit has, in its allotted time, upon this sphere. It were like breaking the twig of a plant upon which a butterfly rests, and on some stormy day, and late in the year. Rodriguez felt all this dimly, but no less surely, and he went to the other window. Below the window were those wars that were soon coming to Spain, hooded in mist and invisible. In the centre of the window swam as profound a blue, dwindling to paler splendour on the edge. The wandering lights were as lovely as in the other window just to the left. But in the view from the right-hand window, how sombre a difference! A bare yard separated the two. Through the window to the left was colour, courtesy, splendour. There was Death at least disguising himself, well cloaked, taking mincing steps, bowing, wearing a plume in his hat and a decent mask. In the right-hand window all the colours were fading. War after war they grew dimmer, and as the colours paled, Death's sole purpose showed clearer. Through the beautiful left-hand window were killings to be seen, and less mercy than history supposes, yet some of the fighters were merciful, and mercy was sometimes a part of Death's courtly pose, which went with the cloak and the plume. But in the other window, through that deep beautiful blue, Rodriguez saw a man making a new ally, an ally who was only cruel and strong and had no purpose but killing, who had no pretences or pose, no mask and no manner, but was only the slave of Death and had no care for his business. He saw it grow bigger and stronger. Heart it had none, but he saw its cold steel core scheming methodical plans and dreaming always destruction. Before it faded men and their fields and their horses. Rodriguez saw the machine. Many a proud invention of ours that Rodriguez saw raging on that ruinous plain he might have anticipated, but not for all Spain would he have done so. It was for the sake of Spain that he was silent about much he saw through that window. As he looked from war to war he saw almost the same men fighting, men with always the same attitude to the moment, and with similar dim conception of larger, vaguer things. Grandson differed imperceptibly from grandfather. He saw them fight sometimes mercifully, sometimes murderously, but in all the wars beyond that twinkling window he saw the machine spare nothing. Then he looked farther, for the wars that were farthest from him in time were farther away from the window. He looked farther and saw the ruins of Peron. He saw them all alone in their doom at night, all drenched in white moonlight, sheltering huge darkness in their stricken hollows. Down the white street, past darkness after darkness as he went by the gaping rooms that the moon left mourning alone, Rodriguez saw a captain going back to the wars in that far future time, who turned his head a moment as he passed, looking Rodriguez in the face, and so went on through the ruins to find a floor on which to lie down for the night. When he was gone the street was all alone with disaster, and moonlight pouring down, and the black gloom in the houses. Rodriguez lifted his eyes and glanced from city to city, to Albert, Bapaume, and Arras. His gaze moved over a plain with its harvest of desolation, lying forlorn and ungathered, lit by the flashing clouds and the moon and peering rockets. He turned from the window and wept. The deep round window glowed with serene blue glory. It seemed a foolish thing to weep by that beautiful glass. Morano tried to comfort him. That calm deep blue he felt, and those little lights, surely, could hurt no one. What had Rodriguez seen? Morano asked. But that Rodriguez would not answer, and told no man ever after what he had seen through the window. The Professor stood silent still. He had no comfort to offer. Indeed, his magical wisdom had found none for the world. You wonder perhaps why the Professor did not give long ago to the world some of these marvels that are the pride of our age. Reader, let us put aside my tale for a moment to answer this. For all the darkness of his sinister art, there may well have been some good in the Slave of Orion, and any good there was, and mere particle even, would surely have spared the world many of those inventions that our age has not spared it. Blame not the age, it is too late to stop it. It is in the grip of inventions now, and has to go on. We cannot stop content with mustard gas. It is the age of progress, and our motto is onwards. And if there was no good in this magical man, then may it not have been he who in due course, long after he himself was safe from life, caused our inventions to be so deadly divulged? Some evil spirit has done it. Then why not he? He stood there silent. Let us return to our story. Perhaps the efforts of a clumsy Morano to comfort him cheered Rodriguez and sent him back to the window. Perhaps he turned from them to find comfort of his own. But however he came by it, he had a hope that this was a passing curse that had come on the world, whose welfare he cared for, whether he lived or died, and that looking a little farther into the future he would see Mother Earth smiling and her children happy again. So he looked through the deep blue luminous window once more, beyond the battles we know. From this he turned back shuddering. Again he saw the Professor smile with his lips, whether at his own weakness, or whether with cynical mirth at the fate of the world, Rodriguez could not say.
Rodrigo's cultic initiation here doesn't seem to suffice for him to develop any new virtues using the Ars Magica initiation rules. The initiation has taken place at a special time and place, and the mystagogue is one of exceptional ability. However, these things together don't seem to suffice unless Rodrigo has developed a flaw from looking in the windows. Perhaps he's lost one of his personality traits, although he seems to hold to his code of chivalry and his belief in the system of honour in later chapters. We don't see a dread foreboding in him anywhere. Perhaps this is merely a minor preparatory ritual which purifies him for the greater suffering which he is going to have when we next visit him, in which he will face existential terror and a near-death experience.